What most adolescents or students of these topics and parents and teachers and all sorts of other adults want to know is, okay, so if we know adolescents are experimenting by and large, what does this mean for them? Is this problematic? Even if we're on board with the idea that most of these problems are transient and they're not or transitory and they're not going to stay on forever, is it still problematic for an adolescent to be using substances? And in short, that's not an easy question to answer. It's not an easy question to answer because our biologies are quite different. And similarly, the amount that you're using or not using also is going to vary, and that can affect the outcomes. What we do know is that the brain is still malleable. We've been talking about this throughout the whole adolescence section. So, by the fact that it is malleable, experimentation can be harmful. There is some research that shows that long-term exposure to marijuana, let's say starting in early adolescence, can actually lead to some cognitive impairments. But the data still is pretty limited because of all of these individual differences. What we also know is that dopamine levels can be affected by extended drug use. And so we've already talked about this a little bit when we were talking about changes in the brain to dopamine levels. But as a whole, one of the reasons why people do drugs is to feel good. And this is partly in part because of rising dopamine levels. And so some research has found that frequent use of drugs can interfere with the normal development of the dopamine system. So the broad idea here is that just like we were talking about in cognitive development, if you normally need, a little rush in order just to feel good, if you continue to have this rush when you are using drugs, then what do you need to do in order to feel good without drugs? You need to do more. So it's affecting the dopamine system. This is an overly simplistic view about these ideas, and for those of you who are psych majors, I encourage you to take Dr. Stau's Drugs and Addiction class, which is a 400 level class at some point in your career, and she would go into way more detail about these topics. We also have limited data on some of these topics in adolescence because we can't force a group of adolescents to ethically consume, a whole bunch of drugs or alcohol and see what happens. We're not able to do that. We can look at individuals, adolescents who are already using drugs and compare them to adolescents who aren't using drugs. But this is muddied by the fact that some of the adolescents who are already using drugs might have other family issues and or issues with poverty that complicate things. What we can do, and you can argue whether this is still an ethical question, but we can use animal models. We can actually take adolescent rats, and adolescent rats have a lot of similarities in terms of cognitive development and behavioral development compared to adolescent humans. And what we can do, like you see this rat here drinking beer, we can look to see what does a lot of, what the effect is of having a lot of substances on their brains. What does that look like? And in these animal model studies, we have found that exposure to drugs in adolescence can permanently affect the dopamine functioning, as I already mentioned. And in reality, it becomes more necessary to use drugs just to feel normal pleasure. So this isn't something that is just anecdotal or theoretical. We can actually see this in animal models. Sometimes students and others ask, well, how much drugs do you have to do in order for this to be problematic? And again, there's not one right answer. It depends on the person. It depends on your genes. Some people are more easily addicted than others. And if you're easily addicted, then this could lead to repeated use. That's the way addiction works, which is more likely to affect the brain. In general, what I tell students is that if you know that addiction problems are a part of your family history, then it would probably be in your best, to be in your best, can't think of the word right now, but it would be wise to be mindful of the amount of alcohol and or substances that you're consuming, because it could also be that you have this predisposition to have an addiction. Just wanted to talk about a few other findings as it relates to drugs and the adolescent brain. There is research that shows, again, this is something that we're not experimentally manipulating. It's just looking at the data that already exists based on adolescents who are engaging in these behaviors. There's data to suggest that for those individuals who begin drinking in early adolescence, so in early adolescence, we're talking, 12, 13, 14 years old, they are 5 times more likely to develop a substance abuse problem at some point compared to those who start drinking alcohol at 21. This is complicated. We can look at this finding and maybe you're already thinking about the factors that might lead somebody to start drinking really early. And those factors are all also ones that might be associated with substance abuse problem. So for example, let's say that, I'm not sure research has been done on this, but I'm hypothesizing a possible factor. But maybe early physical abuse might lead someone to start drinking early, but physical abuse might also be associated with substance abuse in adulthood. So you see that there are lots of possible mechanisms for this. But still, just looking at this finding as is, 5 times more likely. Another interesting finding is that when we look at alcohol in particular, in adolescence, the short-term effects of drinking alcohol aren't as severe as they are in adulthood. So, for example, we know that hangovers in adolescence typically don't last that long, whereas in adults, they typically last longer. But the long-term outcomes in adolescence are worse than they are in adults, by and large, and particularly how they affect the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. I'll talk about the hippocampus in just a second, but the prefrontal cortex, recall, is the area of the brain that is still developing into one's early 20s. The hippocampus is responsible for memories, is one thing it's responsible for. And I think an interesting finding is that if you've ever heard or experienced yourself someone blacking out because of alcohol, the reason that you're blacking out is because memories weren't able to be made in the hippocampus, essentially. And so a blackout session is really that alcohol affects the memories that are being created in the hippocampus. So what happens long term if you have multiple blackout sessions? Then this again is something that could be affecting the hippocampus long term. Now I'm going to talk about some of the causes and consequences of abusing substances. And on the slide that follows, I'm going to be talking about the causes and the consequences of abusing substances. So I want to be clear that I am distinguishing between just using versus abusing. Those are two different concepts. In this particular study that is referenced here, they classified adolescents into one of 4 different groups. So the first group of adolescents were those who just abstained, so who reported not using alcohol and or drugs, just period. The other group were individuals who use more of these common substances, so marijuana or alcohol, but nothing else. There was a third group who were classified as hard drug users. So you can assume that they're also using marijuana or alcohol, but they're also dabbling in, let's say, cocaine or into prescription pills. And the last group is those who are frequent users. So this group is separate. They could be using all of the drugs, but the issue here is that it's not just dabbling. It's not just on the weekend. It's way more common than that. And what these researchers were interested in is how do these groups differ from one another? If we're talking about just using substances versus abusing substances, are there differences? And what they found is those adolescents who just experiment with alcohol or marijuana. So what this means is they're not doing it every day. It might be, just around friends or socially. What they found here is that when we're looking at psychological adjustment, so this can mean how well are you doing in your social life? How well are you doing in your own mental health? How well are you doing academically? The individuals who experimented were no different than those who abstained completely. So individuals who experimented with marijuana or alcohol, not the harder drugs, just marijuana or alcohol, and those who abstained were no different. But the individuals who experimented and or abstained were definitely different than those who were frequent users. This probably is not something that is surprising to you at all. So those who were frequent users tended to suffer in terms of their academic achievement and competence and social competence, overall life functioning. What these researchers also kind of determined was that one of the reasons why we see that experimenters are no different than abstainers is because experimentation often happens in social situations. So for those individuals who are going for, a party on the weekend or they're hanging out with their friends, it's quite common for alcohol or marijuana to be present. And so for those individuals who are more likely to be hanging out in these social situations where these substances are present, these individuals tend to be socially competent already. So they're people who are just interested in hanging out with their friends and having fun. They tend to be better adjusted. And just in general, what they're doing is they're participating in activities in which substances are present. So what I'm saying here is that in some ways, some substances can be a normal part of adolescence. What they also found in this study is that abstainers, so those again who chose to not engage in any kind of substance use, this is in general, this is not saying this applies to everyone, but in some ways these individuals tended to be more inhibited. This should not necessarily be that surprising to many of you, and over-controlled and more anxious. And so actually when we look at the differences between experimenters and abstainers, it is sometimes the case that abstainers actually are less social. This does not apply to everyone, as you are aware, as you can think about the people around you, whether you're somebody who chooses to engage in substance use or not. But this is based on some empirical research looking at 4 different groups of adolescents.